Number 10. The oldest inscription mentioning Odin. In Denmark, a remarkable archaeological find was made with the discovery of a golden disc from the 5th century. It was part of the Vindeliv hoard. This disc contains the oldest known inscription of the name in the Norse god Odin. Yeah, you know Odin, Thor's dad? That guy, on a golden plate. How amazing is that? Previously, the earliest evidence of Odin worship was dated 150 years later, making this discovery quite significant for understanding the pre-Viking spiritual landscape in Scandinavia. Imagine finding a gold disc and you're like, oh, it's the god of thunder. That's neat. How fun is that? Let's sell this. Probably like, what, $40 easy? Whatever. When archaeologists were exploring the Batifrada cave in Italy, they uncovered a remarkable find. They stumbled upon a 7,000-year-old clay female figurine. First of all, kind of haunting. If I found that, I'd probably faint. That's a pretty scary one to pick up. This ancient figurine was believed to be linked to rituals or religious practices, so its discovery provides insights into how early humans viewed the afterlife. Its discovery in such a well-preserved state also allows researchers to better understand the symbolic and ceremonial roles that these figures played in their communities. I'll admit it looks quite alien. It's the size of a tree ornament, but the history behind this figurine is quite large. In Bavaria, Germany, archaeologists discovered an exceptionally well-preserved Bronze Age sword that continues to shine even after 3,000 years. Imagine that. This remarkable find was unearthed in a burial site where it was likely placed as a grave good, highlighting the high status of said individual. The sword's pristine condition and exquisite craftsmanship illustrates the advanced skills of Bronze Age Europeans. Also, imagine finding a sword. How cool is that? It's like a childhood dream come true. This is like something you'd find in Elden Ring. This one is crazy. In the town of Freising, Germany, a medieval skeleton with an iron prosthetic hand was discovered. Yeah, old Bones Jones here met his fate a very long time ago. Experts concluded that he was alive somewhere between 1450 and 1620. Quite old. Imagine digging up medieval medical technology. How amazing is that? The use of a prosthetic hand suggests a relatively advanced understanding of bodily mechanics and an ability to manufacture functional aids, which indicates that disability was both acknowledged and accommodated to some extent during this era, many moons ago. One can only imagine the social status and wealth that might have been associated with individuals who could even afford such devices. That's crazy. People can't afford bread and you can afford an extra limb, an iron limb? Huh, weird flex, but okay. In Norway, during a routine home renovation, homeowners stumbled upon a Viking Age burial site, revealing not just a grave, but a treasure trove of artifacts, including weaponry and jewelry. That's amazing. I would be so scared. We have to move immediately. This place is haunted. These amazing finds go back 1,200 years. Imagine that. You order some renovations and end up finding Norse burial sites. That's fun. The presence of weapons and jewelry in the graves suggests the high status of the individual buried there as well, reflecting the Viking belief in an afterlife where such items were deemed necessary. That's always fun. I hope student loans are necessary in the afterlife, because if so, oh boy! In the historical region of Asturias, Spain, a 2,000-year-old Roman sandal was discovered in an ancient well. First of all, when I say sandal, it wasn't a flip-flop, you know what I mean? When I say sandal, I mean a beautifully decorated artifact, reflecting the sophisticated craftsmanship and fashion sense of ancient Roman life. It wasn't a size 8 rubber, shitty flip-flop you find at like Walmart. No, none of that. This artifact is not just a piece of footwear, but a cultural relic that showcases the Romans' widespread influence all across Europe, including the integration of Roman customs and items into local Spanish life. It's a pretty huge discovery.
Scaphism. This punishment came from ancient Egypt and is easily one of the very worst punishments to reach this list. The condemned would have their lower body locked into a hollow tree or 2 canoes so they could not escape. They would then be fed an exclusive diet of honey and milk, which would cause a very upset stomach and all the foul results of that, which would be collected inside the tree they were locked in and festering. They would then be left in the middle of a stagnant pond and left for the flies. It really depends on what sort of a person you are, but personally, I would rather have a crocodile show up 10 minutes in as opposed to festering for weeks and being slowly devoured by insects and infection. But that's just me personally. Maybe you'd rather have more time to reflect. You really just have the lesser of 2 evils to choose from in this scenario, so choosing the fast way out only seems like the logical approach. It didn't really seem to matter how you went, the executioners just wanted you gone for good. Poena Coulée. Perhaps one of the strangest punishments in all of history, the reality of this punishment is somehow shrouded by by how funny it sounds. This was punishment for the crime of patricide, ending one's father, and involved being sewn into a leather sack with several wild animals, most famously a snake, a rooster, a monkey, and a dog. The sack would then be thrown into the river and forgotten about. There wouldn't be a ton of room for anyone to move around, but the animals would more than likely have a bit more mobility than the human. The animal instinct in this scenario would be to fight for survival, so you can already tell how this one would usually end up. Much like escapism, it's difficult to tell how I'd rather go, from the panic mauling and bites of the numerous other animals condemned to the sack with you, or the slow and terrifying suffocation as water slowly seeped into the sack. You couldn't even be left alone with your own thoughts in your final moments, as the animals just continued to attack. Vlad the aptly named. Vlad Dracul was a ruthless and cruel ruler of Wallachia, became so famed and so aptly named because of a punishment he devised for the enemies of his kingdom. He became known as the Impaler for his love of, well, impaling people. Political enemies, the family of political enemies, the diplomats of other nations, entire armies, and prisoners of other nations, and more than a few of his own people, would be hoisted on a sharpened tree trunk and allowed to simply slide down. There were allegedly 4 of these stakes covered in the condemned in varying states of decay. No wonder he got nicknamed Vlad the Impaler. You can pretty much picture how nasty that must have been, but none of these brutal images seemed to faze Vlad. There were allegedly forests full of these stakes that were covered in prisoners or anyone who had crossed Vlad himself. Perhaps these terrifying trees served as trophies for Vlad, as he seemingly had no interest in cutting them down or disposing of the waste that was resting on top of them. They definitely would have served as a fair warning to everyone to never make Vlad angry. And the Golden Tongue. Perhaps one of the most iconic and famous punishments of the ancient times, this vindictive measure was undertaken in many cultures over many years. The earliest was likely Crassus, the weakest third of the Roman triumvirate, after he lost the Battle of Carrhae. Allegedly in mockery of his lust for gold and wealth, the Parthians allegedly poured molten gold down his throat. Emperor Valerian was also ended this way. After having tried to bribe his way out of captivity, his captors decided to show him how much they valued his own gold and allowed him to drink his fill. During his expansions throughout Persia, Genghis Khan also allegedly made the lord of a town drink his ransom after the lord offered to surrender for several £100 of gold and silver. While this form of punishment was clearly a way of asserting your absolute dominance, it was also considered a poetic way to punish someone for greed.
In ancient India, using elephants to execute criminals wasn't just about punishment, it was a very dramatic display of the king's sheer power and the state's unchallengeable authority. These majestic beasts were trained to crush, dismember, or even torment offenders in front of an assembled crowd. Imagine an elephant, guided by its mahout, methodically stepping on or tearing apart the condemned. A horrifying sight. This method was not only effective in dispensing justice, but also served as a chilling deterrent to would-be criminals. The symbolism was potent. Just as an elephant could control and dominate with its size and strength, so too could the king govern his subjects. Historical records like those from the Mughal era detail how these executions were a public spectacle, emphasizing the gravity of the crime and the consequences of defying royal laws. In ancient India, the punishment of mutilation was not just about retribution, it was a lifelong billboard advertising one's crimes. Take, for instance, the fate of thieves. Caught with your hand in the proverbial cookie jar? Well, you might literally lose that hand. The logic was brutally simple. No hand, no more stealing. Adultery too had its unique markers. Noses were often the price of illicit love. This wasn't just a physical penalty, but a social one, visibly branding the adulterer and affecting their interactions in society. The idea was as much about prevention as it was punishment, serving as a warning to others about the costs of criminal behavior. Such punishments were designed to be as much as a deterrent to the community as they were retribution against the individual, ensuring that every glance in the mirror or sideways look from a neighbor reminded the wrongdoer and others of the steep price of transgression. Impalement in ancient India was as grim as it sounds, a truly chilling method of execution that we've seen come up a lot in history. A long, sharp stake is driven through the body of the condemned, usually from the bottom to the top. The exact trajectory could vary. Sometimes it was a slow and agonizing journey through through vital organs, and other times, if placed just right, it was a mercifully quick exit. This wasn't just about punishing the criminal like a lot of these on this list, it was a public spectacle designed to instill fear and obedience among the populace. Historical records aren't flush with named examples from India, but like I mentioned, similar practices were noted around the ancient world, highlighting the widespread use of this absolutely brutal punishment. In ancient India, the choice of such a method emphasized the absolute power of rulers and the severe consequences of defying the law, serving as a warning that the stakes, quite literally, were high when it came to crime and punishment. Sorry, I couldn't help myself with that one. In ancient India, the concept of a fair trial took a rather fiery, watery, or gravity-defying turn with the use of ordeals meant to determine guilt or innocence. Think of it as the ultimate test of fate, where only the divine could decide your destiny. If you were accused of a crime, you might have to prove your innocence by literally playing with fire or taking a plunge in a water trial. For instance, the ordeal by fire could involve walking through flames or carrying a hot iron. If you emerged unscathed, you were deemed innocent, as it was believed that the gods had intervened to protect the truthful. Similarly, the water ordeal might see an accused thrown into a river. Floating meant innocence, while sinking, somewhat counterintuitively, suggested guilt. Another head scratcher was the ordeal by balance, where you'd be weighed before and after the accusation. If you weighed less afterwards, the loss was seen as the weight of your guilt lifting. These methods were steeped in the belief that supernatural forces would not allow the innocent to suffer, a theory that definitely puts one's fate squarely in the hands of the gods. Wow. If supernatural forces didn't allow innocent people to suffer, the world would be very different. I'm just having a deep thought in the middle of filming this video. Okay, oh my god, I'm losing my mind. Speaking of losing my mind, the next one. Beheading was pretty much the go-to method for executing nobles and royals in ancient India. Sort of like the VIP treatment in the grim world of capital punishment. Seen as a somewhat honorable way to go, especially compared to some of the more brutal methods like being trampled by elephants or impaled. Beheading was quick and believed to be less painful. Historical texts sometimes recount the use of beheading for high-profile traitors or warriors who had fallen from grace. For instance, in some ancient tales, heroic figures captured in battle would be granted this less dishonorable death. It was not only about ending lives, but also about preserving some semblance of dignity in death, ensuring the elite met their end with a swift strike rather than prolonged suffering. Next, we are talking about the wooden collar. So imagine being stuck in a giant, heavy wooden board that wraps around your neck like the world's worst fashion accessory. That is the wooden collar for you, an ancient Chinese punishment that was both a physical and a social torment. Offenders had this massive square board with a hole just big enough for their head locked onto their necks. This clumsy collar made it impossible to eat or drink without help, turning every meal into a public spectacle of dependence and shame. People wearing the collar were often left in public places where the passerby could see their humiliation. And this also wasn't just a quick timeout. We're talking about days, weeks, or even months of lugging this lumbering frame around. It was kind of like a mobile prison that advertised your crime everywhere you went, a constant reminder to others and to yourself about the consequences of breaking the law. Imagine trying to sleep or even just rest with this bulky board. Talk about a literal nightmare. Next, we are talking about foot amputation. Imagine getting caught for a robbery and instead of jail time, they just take your foot off. That's exactly how ancient China when it came to punishing criminals. Foot amputation was a brutally effective way to handle thieves and burglars. Think about it. If you're missing a foot, sneaking around or running away after a heist isn't exactly easy. This harsh punishment served as a gruesome deterrent, sending a clear message to anyone thinking about breaking the law. Steal stuff? Lose a foot. It was about making sure that repeat offenses were next to impossible. Next, we are talking about exile. In ancient China, if you messed up big time, especially if you were a big shot, you might find yourself slapped with a one-way ticket to Nowhere. Exile was a go-to punishment for high flyers who broke the rules. Instead of throwing you in a cell, they'd send you off to the most desolate, unfriendly corners of the country. Imagine being uprooted from your cozy life and dropped into a place with harsh weather, rough terrain, and none of the comforts of home. You'd have to fend for yourself in a land where the locals weren't exactly throwing welcome parties for exiled criminals. This punishment wasn't just about getting you out of sight, it was about stripping you of your status and forcing you to survive in a place where your fancy title meant zilch. Next, we are talking about flogging with a heavy whip. Kind of specific. Now, this wasn't just any old whip. We're talking about a massive, heavy-duty whip made of buffalo leather. This thing was tough, mean, and all kinds of painful. The buffalo leather made the whip thick and weighty, ensuring that each lash wasn't just a sting, but a deep bruising impact that could break skin and leave serious marks. You'd be brought out in front of a crowd because, let's face it, punishments back then were also about sending a message to everyone else. Don't do what this guy did. You'd be tied up, often to a post or sometimes just forced to lay down, making sure you couldn't wiggle your way out of what was coming. The executioner, a guy who is usually pretty burly because swinging that heavy whip was no easy task, would then start the flogging. Based on what you did, the number of lashes would be decided. Stole something minor, maybe like 10 lashes. Something more severe, we could be talking 50, 100, or even more lashes. Each lash from the heavy whip wasn't just a simple hit. The thick buffalo leather could cause gashes, tear into muscle, and even break bones if the hit was in the right spot. If the crime was really serious, the number of lashes could be high enough that the person wouldn't survive. The absolute horror, a punishment that starts out as painful and ends up as lethal. Next, we are talking about the facial tattooing. This was like the ultimate walk of shame. It wasn't like your cool hipster tattoo. This was a big, bold label like thief or traitor inked right onto your forehead, your cheek, sometimes even just the whole thing. First off, this wasn't just a quick in and out at the tattoo parlor, you know, a little walk-in. The process was painful. They used natural dyes, maybe soot or ink, and a needle to etch the words into your skin. There were no numbing creams, of course, so you felt every poke and prod of that needle. The idea was all about shame and prevention. In a time where your reputation was everything, having thief tattooed on your face was a serious blow. It wasn't just a punishment for the crime you committed, it was a lifelong reminder to you and everyone else that you crossed the line. Plus, again, like a lot of these, it was a major deterrent. If you saw someone with thief tattooed on their face, would you hire them? Trust them? Probably not. So this was a way to keep people in line by fear of public humiliation. Having such a tattoo made life incredibly hard. It wasn't like you could just move to another city and start fresh. Your face preceded you everywhere you went. Finding a job, making friends, or even just buying groceries without being judged or shunned was nearly impossible. And finally on this list today we are talking about hair cutting. Now let me tell you about one of ancient China's more unusual punishments that didn't involve physical torment, but was still pretty harsh. Cutting someone's hair. Now, before you shrug it off as a minor penalty, let me set the scene to explain why this was such a big deal back then. In ancient China, your hair was more than just a personal style statement. It was a symbol of your dignity and respect for your ancestors. Confucian teachings emphasized the importance of preserving your body as it was given by your parents, which included your hair. So cutting someone's hair wasn't just a makeover, it was a major sign of disgrace. If someone committed a crime, especially a minor one, the authorities might chop off their hair instead of throwing them in jail or giving them the bamboo treatment. This hair cutting was like a walking billboard saying, "Hey, look at me, I did something wrong." In a culture that valued honor and appearance, this was absolutely brutal. Also, we have to remember, family was everything. If you came home with your hair cut off, you weren't just in trouble, you actually disgraced your entire family. Dinner time would definitely get pretty awkward, and family gatherings? forget about it. You'd be the talk of the town, and not in a good way.
Experts have claimed that the stones of the pyramids were actually made of a very early form of concrete, which was created using a mixture of limestone, clay, lime, and water. The cement binding the limestone was either silicon dioxide, which is the building block of quartz, or a calcium and magnesium-rich silicate mineral. The stones also had a high water content, which was unusual for the normally dry natural limestone found on the plateau. And the cementing phases in both the inner and outer casing stones were amorphous. In other words, their atoms were not arranged in a regular and periodic array. Sedimentary rocks such as limestone are seldom, if ever, amorphous. So the really old limestone is actually so true to the original that it's misled generations of Egyptologists and geologists, all because the ancient Egyptians were the original, albeit unknowing, nanotechnologists. It's more likely than not that the tops of the pyramids are cast, since it would have been really difficult to drag the stones to the summit. Also, casting would explain why some of the stones fit so closely together. Still, as with all great mysteries, not every aspect can be explained. Like how the Egyptians hoisted 70-ton granite slabs halfway up the pyramid remains as mysterious as ever. Also, their houses are pretty intriguing as well. They had courtyards, separate studios. They also had a flat roof where they cooked or slept during hot nights. Folks weren't expected to share, yes, the ideals of cleanliness that we currently hold. But lo and behold, the Egyptians had toilets in their homes and their own systems of drainage and cleaning. Very incredible. So I think for most of us, when we think of ancient Egypt, we're like, hieroglyphs. And what a shame it is that they faded from use. But actually, they kinda didn't. It's more they got really mangled and simplified. Alright, let me try to explain. The specific form of writing we call hieroglyphs today weren't a commonly understood script way back when they were used. Only the rich and well-educated knew how to read them, because there were literally thousands of individual glyphs that you had to learn how to read. So when the poor eventually did learn, they weren't learning hieroglyphics. They were using what was, for lack of a better term, a simplified working man's version. Now, the simplified version that was most commonly used was hieratic, which operated comfortably alongside hieroglyphs for thousands of years. It was mostly used for mundane documents like laundry lists, tax receipts, whereas hieroglyphs were a restricted sacred script, associated predominantly with temples, tombs, and royal monuments. One didn't crowd the other out because they had separate domains. But then as time goes on, you get Demotic, which is a further casual derivation of hieratic, and finally Coptic, which is now essentially the Egyptian language written in modified Greek letters. The latter gained steam once Egypt has well and truly lost its independence. Hieroglyphs hang on, because these are still being used in different domains, but in a weakened state, because the Egyptian king and the temples are weakening. We all know about the Rosetta Stone, the well-known find that made the decipherment of hieroglyphs possible. It was basically a public announcement written up by a Ptolemaic, or Greek Macedonian king of Egypt, which was written in 2 languages via 3 scripts, to reach the largest audience possible. So, it was written once in Egyptian using hieroglyphs, once in Egyptian using the simplified Demotic script, and once in Greek using the Greek alphabet. Knowing that the hieroglyphs would have to say the same thing as the well-understood Greek text, scholars were able to gradually break it down, starting with the names of royal figures, which were singled out in cartouches and spelled very simply, because they were foreign names. Ptolemy, Cleopatra. The other thing to know with the disappearance of hieroglyphs is that religion played a role. Greek and Roman mystery cults appropriated Egyptian texts and recreated Egyptian monuments with purposefully gibberish hieroglyphs because it made the religion seem more occult, special rites that you had to be initiated into to understand. And when Christianity takes hold, the Egyptian religion is something even more pagan and occult, and this isn't really like a good way. And ergo, hieroglyphs are more actively discouraged and destroyed. Wow, Christianity ruining something? Well, couldn't be. Clever Egyptians made great contributions to modern mathematics, like designing decimals, fractions, the number 0, negative numbers, and even the value of pi. They had an understanding of solid geometry, which they combined with their algebra system to construct the pyramids. Now, the practices of the Egyptians focused on math's usefulness as a real-world problem-solving tool. Information on Egyptian mathematics is limited to a scarce amount of surviving sources written on papyrus, but the Egyptians introduced the earliest fully developed base 10 numeration system. They had separate symbols for one unit. A stroke was used for units, a heel bone symbol for tens, a coiled rope for hundreds. Numbers were usually written left to right, starting with the highest denominator. So let's take the number 2525. So the first number on the left would be the 2000, then the 500, the 20, and the 5. The ancient Egyptian civilization also used math for measuring time, straight lines, the level of floodings from the Nile, tax calculation, calculating areas of land, money, and cooking. The Rhind papyrus contains other mathematical knowledge such as unit fractions, composite and prime numbers, arithmetic, geometric and harmonic means, and a lot of other things. They use these concepts in their trade, computing an assortment of land areas, calculating taxes, and a lot of other fun math stuff that my brain's gonna hurt if I talk about. Also, the ancient Egyptians were the first civilization to develop and solve quadratic equations, as revealed by the Berlin Papyrus. And now that I've made my high school math teachers cry, we're moving on.
Up first is the heretic's fork. Humanity really is incredibly creative, sometimes with very ill intentions. During the Spanish Inquisition, a device would be created which not only was viciously effective at instilling pain and regret, but was also almost poetic in its design. Known as the heretic's fork, this tool would be strapped to a person's throat, painfully preventing them from speaking or, more importantly, turning their gaze away from God. This was often used for prolonged periods of time to encourage heretics to recant or convert, force them to bend their necks towards the God they deny until they either concede and become the right kind of Christian, or confess and are sentenced to die. Like all forms of, as the CIA would say, enhanced interrogation, this likely didn't actually get many true confessions, as people in pain and desperation will do pretty much anything to survive. The actual use of these tools is disputed. They certainly were used, but whether as an interrogation tool or as a punishment isn't quite clear. Perhaps it might have served as an all-in-one multi-tool, but no matter how you ended up meeting this device, it was never going to have a very happy ending. Now we have the keel haul. This is one of the most famous and well-known punishments throughout history, and stems from the advent of the Age of Sail. In the 16th century, Dutch ships that had to maintain discipline in the rough conditions of the high seas ended up coming up with some pretty horrific ways to punish people. One of these punishments was that of keel hauling, or of hauling someone down the keel. The person would be tied to a rope and dropped onto the front of the moving ship, allowing them to drag across the entire hull of the ship from front to rear. This punishment wasn't meant to be deadly, though it often was. It was meant to be utterly horrific, and that it definitely achieved. But adding these splinters and barnacles on the hull that could cause brutal injuries, and the rushing waters surrounding you that could flood your lungs, and people often lost their lives while being keel-hauled. Some sailors were even keel-hauled repeatedly, though that was incredibly rare. The gridiron. The gridiron hasn't been used often in history, but in times when a king or emperor wants their victim to perish in an exceptionally gruesome manner, the gridiron gets pulled out. Essentially a massive barbecue, the gridiron was most famously used on St. Lawrence before he was canonized. Lawrence refused to give the church's wealth to the emperor, and so was sentenced to the gridiron. However, the thing that made Lawrence the patron saint of comics is that as he was roasting, he turned to the person cooking him and said, "Turn me over because this side is done." It may not be the most outright horrific way to go, as it's likely the exposed nerves would simply be turned to a crisp, ending the pain very early. However, just the thought of being stuffed in a barbecue for your final moments is completely unsettling.
In a remote desert cave in Israel, archaeologists uncovered Roman swords dating back 1900 years ago. Yeah, we found swords, just a bunch of swords. That's nice. This discovery is massive. This provides a concrete connection to the Romans' military in the region, illustrating their reach and influence during the height of the Roman Empire. The well-preserved state of these swords suggests that they were possibly hidden or lost during military maneuvers or conflicts in the area. Also, these finds not only highlight the strategic importance of the region within the vast Roman territories, the presence of these weapons in a desert cave underscores the challenging conditions Roman armies faced while enforcing Rome's frontier policies and engaging with diverse cultures all across the empire. You had to hide your swords while you're doing your job. Probably a lot of shit going down. Fiddler's Theater, come on down. It's just me and you. What a weird name for this weird thing. Excavations in Rome revealed the remains of the Theatrum Neroni, a private theater used by Emperor Nero, previously known only through texts. Now, this discovery provides a physical context, of course, to historical accounts of Nero's reign. Always fun when you find that. I thought Nero was a brat when he made a palace for his horse, but his own private theater? Imagine doing an entire show for one person. How awkward is that? Although I am kind of doing that right now with Chris over here, our producer, so maybe. Am I Nero? I kind of feel like Nero right now. I don't know. If 1 million people watch this, maybe I'll feel like Nero, but right now not so much. Now I feel silly doing my bits. While investigating a house dating to the 16th century in Old Dongola, once the capital of the medieval Nubian kingdom of Mercuria, a team from the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology discovered this intricate puzzling network of rooms right beneath the floor, right? Just a random find, doing renovations, and now you find this below. What could possibly be hiding below? below. On one of the walls of one of these rooms was a narrow space measuring just 3 feet wide and 9 feet long. That's what archaeologists found several unorthodox paintings that they believe date back to the 13th century. Now, one of these paintings supposedly portrays the Virgin Mary herself. Another painting depicts a scene in which the archangel Michael holds a Nubian king in his arms and presents him to Jesus, who sits on a cloud and of course extends a hand for the king to kiss. You know, that kind of art. It's pretty deep. I don't know what to tell you. This is very uncommon for Christian art. Usually Christian art does not show us interactions or contact between mortals and immortals. So what could this have possibly meant? It's pretty loaded. I don't know. Jesus is floating on a cloud. He's like high-fiving another king. He's dapping him up. It's art. It's whatever you want it to be. Last year was a breakout year for archaeological discoveries. It's no surprise that our last entry on our list today is as crazy as it gets. But before we finish up here, click that thumbs up and subscribe. Gotcha, let's keep going. A Kentucky man was doing some yard work when he accidentally unearthed a crop of Civil War era coins that were tucked away in his cornfield, all of which that have already been sold at auction. So no, you can't get your hands on any of them. Too late, pal. It's intriguing to read about treasure troves being found in these cornfields because it's proof that you never know what you can find. Get out there and go look around. You might find paintings of the Virgin Mary. You never know. I know you can do it. Go find some paintings.
Egyptians made significant findings in culinary arts because they didn't just cook their food using an open fire. They baked, and they also made liquor way ahead of any other culture. So all of their makers made bread from wheat and barley. At the time, other societies that cooked bread were using pots and stone, but Egyptians used closed ovens to let the bread rise and cook. Also, they used honey, fruits such as dates, and butter in order to give their bread texture and better flavor. They also used sesame seeds to garnish their bread. And with their ways with bread, it's kind of safe to say that they were the first bakers who made artisanal pastries, something I am super grateful for. I love a good sesame seed bagel for lunch, and it's neat to trace back the origins of my favorite foods. Also, in addition to good baking, Egyptians also grew grain for the purpose of producing beer. And when they drank, they didn't just pour it into cups. They made specific beer jars just for drinking. We love the class. Unlike most contemporary civilizations, the Egyptians didn't have a calendar based on the moon cycle. Instead, their calendar was based on Earth's revolution around the sun. Turns out, kinda neat. These ancient humans had 365 days in a year and an extra day every 4 years. Julius Caesar later took this idea to Greece during Cleopatra's reign. And hey, it sounds familiar to me. Surprisingly enough, their religion lent support to the science that pervaded their society. In fact, most of their mythological stories revolve around facts that have been proven to be scientifically correct. By the way, fun fact, they were also pioneers in the field of astronomy. In the Edwin Smith Papyrus, there are many recipes to help heal different ailments. In a small section of this papyrus, there are 5 recipes, one dealing with problems that female identity folks might have had, 3 on techniques for refining the complexion, and 1 for ailments that deal with the colon. The ancient Egyptians were known to use honey as medicine, and the juices of pomegranate served as both a delicacy and medicinal. In the Ebers Papyrus, there are over 800 remedies. Some are topical like ointments and wrappings, others were oral medications such as pills and mouth rinses, and others were inhaled. The recipes to cure constipation consisted of berries from the castor oil tree, male palm, and other beans, and that's just naming a couple. One recipe that was known to help headaches called for inner of onion, fruit of the am tree. Now, some of the recommended treatments made use of Mary Jane and incense, which, considering what we know today, pretty advanced. Also, they used metals as treatments. These prescriptions of antiquity were measured out by volume, not weight, which makes the prescription making craft more like cooking than what pharmacists do today, but still pretty neat. The civilization of ancient Egypt was indebted to the Nile River and its dependable seasonal flooding. The river's predictability and fertile soil allowed the Egyptians to build an empire on the basis of great agricultural wealth. Egyptians are credited as being one of the first groups of people to practice agriculture on a large scale, and this was possible because of the ingenuity of the Egyptians as they developed irrigation systems. So their farming practices allowed them to grow staple food crops, especially grains such as wheat and barley, and industrial crops such as flax and papyrus. They excel in horticulture. Orchards and gardens were developed in addition to field planting in the floodplains. The perennial irrigation required by gardens forced growers to manually carry water from either a well or the Nile to water their garden crops. Additionally, while the Nile brought silt, which naturally fertilized the valley, gardens had to be fertilized by pigeon manure. But these gardens and orchards were generally used to grow vegetables, which, dang, The ancient Egyptians had their own religion, and two of their most important gods and goddesses were Osiris and Isis, a brother-sister duo married to each other. Now, unlike most religions where the man is portrayed as dominant and the woman as submissive, the goddess of magic was the dominant one of the duo. Also, every ruler needed a partner in order to rule, and unlike most modern societies, the husband and wife were at the same pedestal. All of this is evidenced by inscriptions depicting the husband and the wife, or pharaoh and queen together, even showing them commanding an army of soldiers, and coins showing faces of both side by side. Divorce and remarriage were common in Egypt at all periods, and were relatively easy and common. Either party could divorce a spouse on any grounds, or basically without grounds, without any interest or record on the part of the state. Although neither party had to provide legal or social, moral, or ethical grounds for divorce, the economic responsibilities spelled out in the cancellation contracts made this a serious step. So normally a married woman was supported by her husband for as long as they remained married, and his property was entailed for their offspring. So if he divorces his wife, he's got to give her dowry back and pay her a fine. If she divorces him, no fine. A spouse divorced for fault including adultery, forfeited his or her share of the couple's joint property. And after the divorce, you can remarry. But until you get that dowry back, or you pay the fine, well, you gotta support me, pal. And finally, from old inscriptions, it seems unlikely that Egyptians ever practiced slavery, which is kind of contrary to popular belief. The laborers who worked on the pyramids or the temples were well fed and housed. Their mummified bodies also indicate that they were locals of the land. They lived close to where they worked and were actually even buried there, literally in the shadows of the pyramids, which considered to be a great honor.
In ancient India, branding wasn't just about marking livestock, it was also a stark punishment for criminals, leaving a permanent scar that spoke louder than words. Imagine having a hot iron pressed against your skin, not just searing the flesh, but also stamping a symbol of your crime for everyone to see. For instance, a thief might be branded with the image of a dog, a symbol that marked them as untrustworthy and sneaky. According to the Manusmriti, a revered Hindu law book, branding was prescribed for various misdeeds, including theft and giving false testimony. This kind of punishment served multiple purposes. It was a painful penalty, a lifelong mark of shame, and a public declaration of one's misdeeds, all rolled into one fiery imprint. It was the ancient world's version of a criminal record that could never leave you behind. In ancient India, tossing someone off of a cliff wasn't just a dramatic way to say goodbye, it was a literal execution method for the worst offenders. Known as throwing from heights, this punishment involved hurling criminals from cliffs or the top of tall structures, and it was just as much about the spectacle as it was about the sentence. The gravity of the crime was matched by the gravity that they faced, quite literally. This method was symbolic too. It represented a cleansing of sorts, removing the unwanted elements from society by physically casting them out. While there aren't many specific historical figures tied to this fate, the method itself underscores the ancient judicial system's blend of harshness and theatrics. Banishment really packed a punch back in the day. Imagine being totally cut off from your family, your friends, and all of the familiar nooks of your neighborhood. That's kind of what banishment was about. It wasn't just a timeout, it was like being told you couldn't play in your own backyard ever again. And then there's exile, which was even more intense, especially if you dabbled in politics a bit too much. You'd have to pack up and leave the kingdom entirely. Think of Rama from the Hindu epic the Ramayana. This guy got hit with a 14-year exile from his own kingdom. That's a long time to be away from home, roaming forests and dealing with all sort of epic challenges. The method of boiling as an execution tool might sound like something straight out of a horror tale, but in ancient India it was a grim reality for those who committed particularly vile acts. A giant cauldron bubbling away with either oil or water at a scalding temperature, the condemned would then be unceremoniously tossed in, facing a gruesome and agonizing end. This extreme punishment was not doled out lightly, it was reserved for the worst of the worst crimes. Crimes so heinous that mere death wasn't punishment enough. Its inclusion in ancient legal codes suggests that it was a vivid, terrifying deterrent used to instill fear and ensure societal norms were not just followed, but revered. So, while the pot for boiling might have been less common compared to other methods, its very existence underlies the harsh justice system of ancient times, where the severity of the punishment matched the perceived immorality of the crime. That'd be so out. Imagine just watching someone boil. I don't know. That's just crazy. And people back in the day really just like gathered. They were like, oh yeah, Timothy's getting executed today. We all gotta go downtown. It's just so crazy. Alright. In ancient India, being sentenced to death by burning was another one of those punishments reserved for the most heinous of crimes. A fiery fate that was as dramatic as it is terrifying. Picture a public gathering, the air thick with anticipation and a little bit of fear, as the condemned is either tied to a stake or hurled into a gaping fire pit. It was a vivid public spectacle meant to sear the consequences of grave sins into the collective memory of the onlookers. Historical texts don't shy away from these grim tales, like the infamous instance of a queen accused of witchcraft, doomed to prove her innocence or perish in the flames. Starting off this list today talking about Ling Chi, or death by 1,000 cuts. This was an ancient Chinese execution method that was as gruesome as it sounds. Imagine being tied up to a post and then having small pieces of your flesh sliced off, one excruciating cut at a time. This wasn't a quick process either. It was designed to be a slow, agonizing ordeal that could last for hours, with the executioner methodically removing flesh to prolong the torment. Used for the worst of the worst crimes like treason, this punishment was meant to be a deterrent, a very visible yet horrifying show of what happens when you seriously betray the empire. Banned in the early 20th century, this brutal practice is just a reminder of how far punishment has evolved from the days when making a spectacle of suffering was the norm. Next, we are talking about nose removal. Cutting off someone's nose might sound like a bit of a bizarre punishment today, but back in ancient China, this was serious business. Known as yi, this penalty was one of the big five in the old school Chinese justice system, along with other cheerful options like tattooing and chopping off feet. More on that later. Picture you're living in the Western Zoo period around the 11th to the 8th century BCE, and yi is all the rage for punishing the bad guys, especially the ones who couldn't break into a city during a siege. This nose-chopping business wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it sat smack in the middle of the punishment scale, tougher than getting some ink on your face as a permanent mark of shame, but not quite as harsh as losing a foot. It first pops up in the Zuli, a classic text on rituals, but it's even scribbled on ancient bones. As time rolled on, especially during the chaotic spring and autumn period from the 8th to the 5th century BCE, people started to cool off on the whole nose-cutting thing, but it of course made a comeback during the Warring States period and the Qin dynasty from the 5th century to 206 BCE. Back then, if you were a soldier or an official who messed up big time, like failing to capture a city, you might find yourself a bit lighter in the nose department. Sometimes they'd really go to town and combine this with other punishments like the tattooing just to add insult to injury. But then Emperor Wen of the Han dynasty came along around 180 to 157 BCE, and he was like, hey, maybe we should just chill out a little bit on the mutilations. He swapped out the nose cutting for a whopping 300 hits with a light stick, which honestly doesn't sound much better, but it's definitely a start. Despite the official ban, this gruesome tradition stuck around in practice here and there, sneaking into the southern and northern dynasties around 300 to 600 CE, and even into the time of the Jurchen Jin dynasty, up to the 13th century. Next, we are talking about boiling to death. Okay, it might sound like a gruesome method cooked up from a horror movie, but it was a very real and terrifying punishment in ancient China, particularly for heinous crimes like killing your own parents. A huge cauldron would be filled with boiling water or oil, and the condemned person would be slowly lowered into it. It's definitely as nightmarish as it sounds, like a scene straight out of a medieval tale, designed to inflict maximum pain and draw out the suffering. This wasn't just about punishing a crime, it was about sending a chilling message to anyone who might dare to commit such a taboo. The authorities used this method to show the power and reach of the law in a way that was as visually shocking and morally horrifying. So next time you're impatiently watching a pot of water boil, spare a thought for the poor souls of ancient times, for whom that bubbling cauldron represented a much darker fate. Next, we are talking about being crushed by elephant. This over-the-top execution method wasn't originally a Chinese invention. It was actually borrowed from nearby cultures and countries like India and Southeast Asia, where elephants were abundant and had a long history of being part of royal courts and armies. Elephants were symbols of royal power and majesty, so using them as tools of execution added a layer of terrifying spectacle to this punishment. Here's how this horrific spectacle would typically unfold. It would start off with the condemned's last walk. The offender, often a prisoner of war or someone guilty of a severe crime like killing or treason, would be led out into a large open space. This space was usually a public area because yes, this was a public execution meant to scare anyone else who might think of breaking the law. Then enter the elephant. A trained execution elephant, which could be as big as 10 feet tall at the shoulder, would be brought in. These weren't your friendly circus elephants, they were trained to kill. The elephant trainer would direct the elephant, often from a seat right on its back. And then finally, the crushing would take place. On a given signal, the elephant would raise its massive foot and then bring it down onto the condemned. Sometimes, to prolong the agony, the elephant would slowly roll its foot back and forth over the body. Other times, the execution was quick, with the elephant delivering a single, bone-crushing blow. The use of an elephant was not just about the physical destruction that it could cause, it was also a deeply psychological method of instilling fear. The very sight of such a giant beast being used as an instrument of death was enough to make anyone think twice about crossing the line. Elephants are extremely intelligent and can be trained, making them more predictable and manageable in crowded execution scenarios.